Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American Republic?
Hello everybody, long-time viewers, listeners to the show know that we've done many shows on something called the American Dream, open of course to interpretation. People have written books about the interpretation of dreams. Mostly people believe that the American dream's in crisis these days. Last year we did a show with a New York Times writer, actually it was a couple of years ago, David Leonhardt, who's written a book indeed called Ours Was a Shining Future, the story of the American dream, which in his view is the story of the death of the American dream. A couple of months ago we did a show with the Financial Times writer Simon Cooper, who believes that it's time for Americans to move to Europe. The American dream exists in Europe, but no longer in America. Not everyone, though, agrees. We did one show with a distinguished photographer, Ian Brown, who suggested that the American dream has been open to interpretation. Even I have got involved in this debate. For episode 2500 of the show, in celebration, I made the argument that I still believe in the American dream. My guest today, I think, might disagree. She's the author of a new book. It's out this week, Bad Company, Private Equity and the Death of the American Dream. Fascinating new book. Megan Greenwell is a longtime editor and writer, and she's joining us from Brooklyn in New York. Megan, congratulations on Bad Company. Before we get to the issue of private equity, what in your view is or should be the American dream?
I mean, to me, the American dream is just the ability to make a better life for yourself, right? And I write about 4 protagonists in my book, all of whom have different specifics about what the American dream means to them. But the gist is always being able to improve their circumstances, usually sort of by their own hard work, right?
And is that a form of agency, that if you choose to come to America to make something or reinvent yourself, the foundations, the society, and above all else, the economy enables you to do that?
Yeah, I think it's so baked into the American identity that it really is up to you, right? It doesn't matter where you come from, what your circumstances are, what your upbringing was. Everybody has an equal chance to make it through, yes, their own agency, their own commitment to do the work. And I think the reality of our economic system has made that, at the very least, a very threatened concept, which is part of why it's so interesting to me, because I love when our founding myths and the reality of the situation are in some sort of tension. Those are very often the most interesting stories to me.
And your story, Megan, and you don't need me to tell you this, is a very personal one. You begin the book, until it cost me my dream job, I'd never given private equity much thought. What is your dream job?
I was the editor-in-chief of a small sports magazine called Deadspin, which was part of a network of sites originally under Gawker Media. And by the time I worked there, it was owned by Univision, the Spanish language broadcaster. And it really was the only job I ever wanted. I had been reading Deadspin since its earliest days. I had loved the site. I thought I could add something to the site without, compromising what it was at its heart. I really admired a lot of the writers and editors there, many of whom had been there for 10 years or more. And so when a private equity company bought our website, my thought was, we were doing well. Our audience was huge for our staff size. We were profitable. Really, by any metric, we were a successful digital media publication. And instead, everything collapsed within about 3 months. I got pushed out of my job. The rest of the staff followed me out the door 2 months later. And the site eventually was sold to a Maltese gambling operation.
So in a way, and this is the sort of the personal narrative in the story, are you suggesting that, particularly in terms of your experience in Deadspin, you had this dream job? You were a journalist at Deadspin. You always wanted that job. It was a profitable business. It'd been sold or taken off from Gawker, Nick Denton's empire, and sold to Univision. And then some private equity people came in and shut the business down and sold it off. Are you suggesting in an odd way, and this seems to be one of the curious, perhaps the ironic narratives in your argument, that there's something anti-capitalist about private equity?
Yeah, this was one of the things that got me very interested in private equity early on. I do not have a background as a finance reporter. I started researching this because I was interested in what had happened to me and how it plays out in other industries. And as soon as I started reading economic history and economic theory, it really struck me that as much as, our society lionizes free market capitalism, and as much as in some ways private equity is sort of the logical endpoint of free market capitalism, it actually does seem to violate it in some pretty key ways. The free market requires workers and employers to have equal information. That's just sort of fundamental economic law. And that is certainly not true in the case of big private equity leveraged buyouts. The private equity firms are very secretive, don't really tell anybody what they're up to, and they use that to their advantage. And one thing that really stuck with me from the earliest days of my reporting was rereading Milton Friedman, the godfather of free market economics in this country. And in his famous New York Times essay from 1973 that outlines his philosophy of shareholder value theory, essentially the idea that the only purpose of a company is to make money, he carves out exceptions for businesses that fulfill a public service. So he specifically names schools and hospitals. Education and healthcare are two of the biggest areas of investment for private equity firms today. And so it did really strike me that even in Milton Friedman's definition of this perfectly functioning free market economic system, it doesn't really leave room for a lot of what's happening with private equity today.
Yeah, and you write, you've got an interesting Atlantic piece adapted from the book about a Wyoming hospital, I was going to say hotel, hospital, upending the logic of private equity. And of course, examples of private equity companies, the best known one perhaps is Blackstone.
Mm-hmm.
I went to their website. It's a very black website, appropriately.
Yes.
Before we get to the critique, though, Megan, let's define what, I don't mean to be too professorial here, but what exactly is private equity? What does it mean? It's often one of those terms that gets thrown around, and half the time, my sense is people don't even know what they're talking about.
Yes. People will very frequently send me an article and say, here's a business failure that's attributable to private equity. And I will say, well, no, that's venture capital, which is a completely different thing.
Not completely. I mean, they're not entirely different.
They're not entirely
people
different.
do confuse them, and it might be good to compare them as well as you define what PE is.
Sure. And there are a lot of firms that do both, right? And private equity firms can do a lot of different things. But I think classically, when we talk about private equity, and certainly what I focus on in the book, is leveraged buyouts. And essentially, what a private equity leveraged buyout is a private equity firm bundles money from outside investors. So pension funds, university endowments, investment banks, ultra wealthy individuals, all of that, and then combines that money with money they've taken out in loans to buy a company. So about 80%, 70 to 80% of any given leveraged buyout, the money will come from loans. The trick with leveraged buyouts is the debt from those loans is assigned not to the private equity firm that has decided to take the money out, but to the company that it is acquiring. So if I decide to buy your company, I can take out a bunch of money and then have no responsibility for it whatsoever, which is, I think, what leads to a lot of the problems with the private equity system, just the fact that they don't really have skin in the game. Venture capital, on the other hand, they're not typically buying companies outright. They're investing in startups that they're excited about. And the only way to make money from venture capital is for the company in which you are investing to do well, right? You're hunting unicorns, companies that will get to $1 billion valuation. In private equity, you don't necessarily need the company you're acquiring to make money for the firm to make money. So you end up with this weird split in incentives where what's good for me as the private equity firm is not necessarily what's good for the company I'm acquiring.
Should we historicize it? You mentioned Milton Friedman, one of the fathers of what people now write off as neoliberalism. What you're describing is the financialization of the economy. Is there a date that we should begin our history, our analysis of private equity? Was it a phenomenon of the Reagan years? Did it begin then?
So it really intensified during the Reagan years. But in terms of the earliest seeds, it actually goes back to like the 60s. And originally, what became private equity was what they called bootstrap deals, which were essentially mostly small family-run companies who showed some sort of potential to expand and build their business, but didn't have the capital to do it. And so a firm would come in, give them a bunch of money, help them grow, and then flip it, take the company public or sell it for a huge profit. That was where it started. One of the earliest huge, important private equity deals was a company called Hyundai, which was an auto parts manufacturer in Buffalo, New York. And that was a similar concept to the earlier bootstrap deals, take a small company, help it grow really fast. The difference in that one was they did take out a tremendous amount of debt. And so it was one of the first big deals where the firm wasn't putting very much on the line. And I have a quote from a rival firm executive at that time who told the New York Times, we all looked at this deal and we said, holy mackerel, we can do that too. And so that was really the turning point of people figuring out there was a way to make a bunch of money for the firm without taking on much of the risk. And then KKR was one of the earliest big leveraged buyout firms. They broke off from Bear Stearns because they wanted to do more ambitious deals. And the titular KKR humans were two younger guys and one older guy, Jerome Kohlberg. And Kohlberg ended up leaving the firm because he thought his younger partners were being too hostile toward the companies that they were taking over.
The way you're presenting this, Megan, is private equity isn't illegal. You're playing within the rules of the game. Those rules of the game have lessened, of course, or have eased over the last 50 years since the 1960s. Is your critique of capitalism generally, financial capitalism, or is it a critique of these relaxed laws that enable private equity? Because you're not suggesting that these people are actually breaking the law, are you? Maybe they're breaking a kind of moral law, but not the actual law.
No, they're certainly not breaking the law. The private equity lobby has long been very, very powerful, and they have made sure that there is no, there are very few laws regulating what they do or even demanding that they disclose a lot of what they do. So I am certainly not alleging anything illegal here, and nor do I think I'm critiquing capitalism as a whole. Like I say, I think this is sort of a corruption of free market capitalism in a lot of ways. I do think that it is a problem that this system tends to work out very badly for a huge number of the companies that get taken over, and that there are no laws to prevent that, right? So I am not saying eliminate big financial firms altogether. I am saying that if big financial firms can run companies into the ground while still making a profit for themselves, we maybe have a broken system that needs some addressing. One of the big stories in my book is about Toys R Us, which was owned by two private equity firms, KKR and Bain Capital, as well as a real estate investment trust. And that was a deal where the private equity firms made money off of Toys R Us. And Toys R Us went out of business without paying any severance to the 33,000 workers. So that split in incentives that I talked about is causing problems for the companies that get acquired while allowing private equity firms to get off scot-free. And that doesn't seem like the ideal version of free market capitalism to me.
And there does seem to be, again, a kind of colonial quality to private equity now. The headlines, when I was researching this interview, the headlines about private equity are all about sports, college sports teams, which I'm guessing, given your background at Deadspin, would be particularly interesting. So just explain, Megan, you noted that Deadspin was a profitable business, profitable online magazine. Why would it be in the interest of the private equity buyout people to shut the business and lay off its staff?
So I don't think their goal was to shut down the business. I think they were in so far over their heads in terms of not knowing how to run a digital media business. They had not really been in the media business in a serious way before, and their handpicked CEO had been in the media business before, but his experience in the media business was mostly at Forbes, where the model was an absolute fire hose of content to just goose traffic numbers. By the time Deadspin got bought, this was 2019, and the entire web ecosystem had changed, right? The idea of just like printing literally thousands of articles per day to get a few clicks on each one of them and add up to a huge number of clicks was not how you made money in a digital media business in 2019, and certainly wasn't now. So I don't think they knew what they were doing. And I had conversations with my new bosses that indicated they truly had no idea what they were doing. So they really wanted us to be bigger than ESPN. And I would say things like, okay, so part of the reason ESPN is so big is because they have the rights to broadcast sports games, right? Surely you're not saying we're going to be competing for NBA rights. And I would see this look come over their faces that they had never considered that one key difference between Deadspin and ESPN was that we weren't broadcasting games. So I don't think they knew much about what they were walking into, and nor do I think they had any curiosity about what they were walking into. They just thought they could turn traffic up, as if adjusting the temperature of a faucet. And we were trying to say that's not really how the business works, and they didn't care.
Well, perhaps they just weren't very good private equity people. They sound rather dim to me.
I don't think they were the cream of the crop in terms of private equity. They were a small Boston-based firm. We're not talking about KKR or Blackstone here. But they have done very well as a company. I do think they've made money for themselves. they've just not done very well by many of the companies they've acquired.
Megan, some people might be watching this and thinking, well, that was bad luck for Megan. She had a dream job, and then these idiot private equity people came along and shut the company. But the nature of American capitalism is, and indeed the nature of the American dream is, Megan needed to get up, dust herself off, and do her own startup. Find the original team at Deadspin, maybe go back to Nick Denton at Gawker, or somebody else, some other investor. You're originally from the Bay Area, there's no lack of investment, no lack of capital for innovators like yourself. Why not just do that? Who cares about that particular experience? Why did you take it so badly?
Well, I'm happy to say that that's essentially exactly what happened. I helped start it. I did not go to work there full time, but my coworkers founded a new sports publication called Defector. Almost everybody from those days of Deadspin now works at Defector. And Defector is actually a worker-owned company that publishes their financials in great detail every year, and is doing quite well. They have a huge subscriber business. They're doing great. So I took it hard, and my career has been just fine as well. I didn't go work there in part because I wanted to focus on being able to do this book, but the book is not a product of spite. The book is a product of, this experience made me really interested in how and why this system works the way it does. And so, yeah, I absolutely took it hard because I wanted to continue in that job. But ultimately, I'm very grateful for it because I got to work on this project that, I feel really passionately about, and I'm really proud of the results. And I would not have come up with this book idea had it not been for that experience.
Yeah, you got bad company out of it. So we should be thanking those
exactly
idiot PE people. You're not the first or the last person, Megan, as you know, to write books on private equity.
No.
A few years ago, we did a show with Brendan Ballou, Plunder, Private Equity's Plan to Pillage America. It's always about pillaging or the end of the American dream. I know your book, though, if there's a way to distinguish, would it be fair to say that it's less of an economics primer and more of a narrative, a personal narrative of humans who are affected by bad private equity? Is that fair?
Yeah, exactly. So Brendan and I actually went to college together, and I'm such a fan of his.
Oh, you did? So
yes.
Wow. And you both ended up writing books on private equity.
Yes. And we came to it from very different perspectives. Brendan's so smart. And he was a Justice Department lawyer working on regulating private equity at the time his book came out. I am so not a lawyer or an economist. I have spent most of my career doing narrative journalism, really immersing myself in the lives of people. And so, in part because Brendan's book had come out and other great books that sort of provided a 10,000-foot view of the private equity industry had already come out, I wanted to do something very different. And so what I pitched was, let's look at how this affects workers and communities and really look from the ground level. So the stars of my book are 4 protagonists, one for each of 4 different industries: retail, media, housing, and healthcare. And those, by telling those people's stories, I think the book isn't quite out yet, but I think I will be able to.
I think it will be out by the time people see this, Megan.
Yes. Well, okay. So the goal is for people to come to understand and feel invested in this subject because they care about these people's stories. The 4 protagonists are just pretty extraordinary people who I think readers are really going to enjoy reading about. And my theory is that will do an effective job of getting people to care about private equity who might not necessarily pick up a book that's explicitly sort of an introduction to how the system works.
one of the characters I know you write about is a woman from South Texas called Natalia Contraras. Tell us about her and why you chose her and why her story is so pertinent in the context of private equity.
I was really interested in writing about local media because it felt like I needed to include media in some sense in the book because it has been such fertile ground for private equity firms. But I did not want to write about my own story, and I did not want to write about Deadspin. I was really interested in writing about local media because, you know, in so many places, the media industry has been so decimated that if you lose the one local newspaper, that's it. There is no other source of information. And there are plenty of academic studies that show that there are all sorts of really devastating negative repercussions for communities that don't have local news. So, among other things, their tax rates go up as a direct result of not having local news. So, I found Natalia, who spent much of the early part of her career working at Gannett, which had been owned by a private equity firm, and later, you know, a private equity firm was their primary investor and debt holder. And Natalia is a really interesting character. She's a Mexican immigrant, came to the US when she was in middle school, enrolled in a middle school that did not have English as a second language classes, so sort of had to brute force teach herself English just to get through school. And she's, you know, she's a firecracker. She will just talk at you for days and days and days.
So she sounds like Exhibit A in The American Dream, the immigrant.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think she's exactly who people are thinking of. You know, she made it to community college in El Paso, Texas, did not graduate from a 4-year school, but managed to get a reporting job and just sort of work her way up. And she was telling, you know, she felt really strongly and still does about telling the stories of other immigrants, other people of color, people creating small businesses. And now she writes about voting in elections and how that affects different groups of people. And so her story of being the chair of her union at a Gannett newspaper and just constantly fighting because they were always saying, you know, there's no money, there's no money, there's no money. She realized later because all the money was in debt. She was just a really compelling character in terms of showing who is affected when these deals go badly.
Marx, of course, famously wrote that we make our own histories, but not quite in the way we imagine. In terms of your 4 characters, were you the one educating them about the impact of private equity, or were they the ones educating you? Were they aware of how private equity destroyed their American dream?
They were all aware by the time I started talking to them, but one common thread was that I learned that very few workers know that private equity owns their employer until it all falls apart, right?
Mm.
So Natalia did not know the specifics of who was in charge of Gannett because she worked at a newspaper, her bosses worked at a newspaper, her boss's bosses worked at Gannett, her paycheck said Gannett. My Toys R Us character had no idea that private equity owned Toys R Us. Everybody she had ever spoken with the company worked for Toys R Us proper. And I think that is a very common thing. You know, if the name on your paycheck is the company you work for, most people don't then look into all of the details of, okay, but who's their parent company, you know? And so some of my characters ended up plunging very, very deeply into the specifics of how private equity had upended their company. Probably most notably, the woman who worked at Toys R Us, who became a real activist. Others knew in broad terms, but had not looked much into the specifics. So they've all read the book. I think they all learned some things about, you know, what contributed to their own experience from the book. But more importantly to me, they all taught me an awful lot about what that experience looked like on the day-to-day level.
Megan, when I think about Toys R Us, it reminds me of driving through America and seeing these bombed out malls of closed shops, $1 stores. Everybody knows that image. Are you arguing in an odd way that there's a vampire-like quality to private equity, that it's quite literally sucking the life out of America? One of the headlines about your book in the Rolling Stone is about how this industry, private equity, is sucking the life out of America. Another headline from Verge talks about how private equity is not just killing companies, but communities. So when we drive across America and we see these scenes almost apocalyptic of closed malls and empty stores and decimated communities, we can think of it in part, at least, in terms of the consequences of private equity.
I think that's entirely fair. Yeah. I mean, in the retail industry, for example, private equity firms will say, well, the reason, retail is so threatened now is all because of Amazon. And I don't claim that Amazon has nothing to do with it. Of course, any sort of behemoth, will make it much, much harder for everyone else. But I argue in the Toys R Us section of the book that because private equity had decimated Toys R Us and some of these other retail chains so thoroughly and buried them under so much debt, they never had a prayer of competing with Amazon because they didn't have the money, the liquid capital, to make basic store improvements, right? There are examples of chains that have continued to do really well in the Amazon era, but there are fewer and fewer of them. And that is in large part, I think, because of private equity. There was a landmark study that found that 10 times as many private equity owned companies enter bankruptcy proceedings as other types of companies, which accounts for, a significant minority of all retail bankruptcies in the US. And so I think that it is absolutely fair to say that there is a vampiric quality going on here where businesses are being destroyed by this group of people who are really only in it for themselves.
And of course, some of the more profitable private companies like Whole Foods get acquired by Amazon.
Yeah, absolutely.
I noted earlier that you feature or you warn about the impact of private equity on healthcare and education. You've got a really nice piece borrowed from the book in the Atlantic on a Wyoming hospital. Is one of the problems, and again, this isn't so much a critique of private equity, but of the broader, colonization of American life by American capitalism or by the market, that private equity is now in this vampire-like way beginning to suck the blood, not just of retail stores or online publications, but also of schools and hospitals.
Yeah, I think that's a really important transition that has mostly happened in the 2010s and 2020s. This is a fairly recent phenomenon. And you can be upset about Toys R Us going out of business. I was certainly upset about Deadspin going out of business. I was never under the impression that Deadspin was curing cancer, right? But when private equity starts getting involved in hospitals, we have real problems. So I write about a rural hospital in Wyoming where there isn't another hospital for almost 30 miles. And that 30 miles is through a windswept canyon where if there's a Wyoming snowstorm, you may not be getting through there. And so what happens is a town of 10,000 people no longer has reliable access to healthcare as a direct result of private equity greed. And I think we need to have a real reckoning about what it means that public services like healthcare, like housing, can just be completely removed from a population because they're unlucky enough to not be able to afford a fancier apartment, because they're unlucky enough to live in a rural area instead of an urban one. There are very serious consequences here that are certainly more severe than a big box chain or a sports magazine going out of business.
My understanding, Megan, is that America has been having that conversation, and the country made a decision, for better or worse, in electing Trump. Trump and his new administration seems to be doubling down on if not on private equity, on the financialization of everything, challenging universities and schools, taking away more and more public funding. You wrote this book, I'm guessing, mostly before Trump came back to power.
Yes.
But is this new administration, my sense or my guess would be that it's doubling down on the principles of private equity, or is that unfair?
I think that's largely true. The private equity industry was very supportive of Trump's campaign, financially and otherwise. Steven Schwartzman, who runs Blackstone, was the single biggest donor to Trump's campaign. So yes, I think there is a tight alliance between private equity and Donald Trump. There are plenty of private equity people in his administration. The caveat I will offer to that, and it's been a bit of a surprising one to me, when Trump was in office the first time, he said he would like to see the carried interest loophole closed. The carried interest loophole is a tax break that allows private equity firms to avoid having most of their profits taxed as regular business income and rather have it taxed as carried interest, i.e., we'll collect on that later. And so the result is their tax bills are much, much, much smaller than other forms of businesses. Trump said when he was in power the first time that he wanted to close that loophole and tax private equity companies like other types of businesses. Obama had said the same thing when he was president, and Biden said the same thing. None of them managed to see that come to fruition because Congress always shot it down. Surprising a lot of observers, Trump has said again multiple times this spring that he would like to see the carried interest loophole closed. I think most of us thought that he would drop it this time and just let that quietly continue to exist. And I think because of the unique stranglehold Donald Trump holds on the Republican Party, it does seem like there's some chance that him wanting to close it this time ends up being the thing that gets it closed. Because as afraid as many people in Congress are of offending the private equity industry, I think many Republicans are probably even more afraid of offending Donald Trump. And so this has not come up in Congress yet, but I expect that it will. And I certainly would not put money on it being closed this time, but I think it's more possible than at any time in the last several years.
Maybe you should put some other people's money, some private equity money on it. It'd be interesting to see what Steven Schwartzman, as you say, one of Trump's biggest backers, thinks of this. The book's getting great reviews, Megan. Partially, I think, because it's not entirely dark. It has a positive message in a sense. I got a lovely starred review on Kirkus. It described it as a humane look at financial practices hobbling venerable institutions, and suggests that there are examples of people fighting back. I know you write about that in Wyoming too. What positive? I mean, the death of the American dream, as I said, we've done many shows about it. You seem to be suggesting that in spite of the vampire-like quality of private equity, the American dream might not be entirely dead. What's the positive message in the book?
I felt really strongly about finding characters who are trying to do something about this problem, in part because I'm not an activist. I wasn't going to end my book with, my own personal recommendations of what to do. I'm a reporter, but nor did I want to end the book on a note of, wow, isn't everything terrible? It just felt sort of unsatisfying, I think. And it also didn't feel true to me because, as rampant as private equity is in our economy, there are a lot of people making some progress. So there is no there has been no meaningful regulation of private equity on the federal level, and I don't see a lot of potential for that without a pretty dramatic change to the composition of Congress. However, there have been some really interesting regulatory efforts on the state level. So, Massachusetts at the end of last year passed a major bill increasing scrutiny of private equity deals in healthcare. That's a really important step. Um, there's also a lot of work being done to target the pension funds and say, look, don't invest in private equity if they can't commit to keeping worker treatment to, some sort of standard. In the case of Toys R Us, the woman I write about and some colleagues ended up pressuring the pension fund in Minnesota to temporarily stop investing in KKR at all until they agreed to pay the Toys R Us workers some severance. There's also some really interesting work being done to reinvent industries. We all know that there are fundamental problems in each of these industries that far predate private equity, and where private equity is taking advantage of the conditions, not inventing the conditions out of whole cloth. And so a lot of the work I was particularly interested in was who is out there trying to rebuild a healthier version of their industry. So in the local media section, for example, the woman I profile, Natalia, who we talked about, ended up going to work for a startup local nonprofit news outlet. There is a big wave of these nonprofit startups going on right now, largely because there's one huge funder called the American Journalism Project that is funding a lot of them. And a lot of those publications are doing really, really well, have very quickly become financially sustainable. And by financially sustainable, right, these are nonprofits. So they're not trying to goose shareholder value. They just want enough to grow what they're doing, gradually over time. And so they're also out there, winning Pulitzers. And so I think that kind of work is just as important and more likely to be overlooked than some of the regulatory efforts.
And finally, Megan, ultimately, as you pointed out, I think, or suggested, this will become a political issue. It already is in terms of regulation. Do we need a new generation of progressive politicians who are not just anti-capitalist like Bernie Sanders or perhaps even AOC, who understand the complexities of the financial system, who understand the impact of PE on ordinary people's lives, but also who recognize the centrality of the market in American economics and culture? Do we need politicians to become, if you like, the Teddy Roosevelts of the early part of the 21st century?
I think if we're serious about changing this system, which has clearly caused a lot of damage, then yes, we're going to need a lot more of those kinds of politicians. And I think you're right to identify that does not necessarily mean anti-capitalists. So the loudest voice on regulating private equity has been Elizabeth Warren, who's not remotely an anti-capitalist, but she is a law professor. She has obviously worked in financial regulation at the federal government level. And she has proposed what she calls the Stop Wall Street Looting Act, which would regulate private equity several times. She doesn't even have the votes to get it out of committee, much less to make it law. But I think it's interesting that she, who is, perhaps more educated than anyone else on Capitol Hill about this subject and is by no means an anti-capitalist, is the one who is out there pushing the hardest for change on this front. And so, will she recruit more people to the cause over time? Quite possibly. But without doing that, she is going to sort of continue to be a lone voice in the wilderness.
Yeah, we had Zephyr Teach out on the show a couple of years ago, anti-monopolist, activist, writer. She has a new book out. And of course, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Megan, but presumably this critique or defense against the vampire-like qualities of private equity needs to be discussed in the context also of antitrust and of large companies, which Teach Out focuses on, and of course, Elizabeth Warren as well. So it's not just a single subject, it's a broader critique.
Yeah, absolutely. Teach Out has been such a powerful voice on this issue. Lena Khan, who until recently was running the FTC, was very concerned about private equity and having the conversation along with antitrust and monopoly conversations, as you point out. And she and Zephyr Teach Out did an event together last week. And I think they're both very, very smart on how to regulate this in a serious way that's not about burning down the entire capitalist system. So yeah, there are interesting voices out there.
Very interesting. Well, yours is one of those voices. Your new book, Private Equity and the Death of the American Dream, is out this week. It offers an alternative, I think, to the abundance argument being put forward by people like Ezra Klein. Congratulations, Megan, on the new book, Bad Company. You are, sorry to give this rather boring joke, good company, and we will get you back on the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew. It was such a nice conversation.